Hi everybody, welcome back. Sorry for the delay on these videos here. We had some technical difficulties, but I am actually recording this time, or at least so I believe, so we'll see how that goes. Okay, so basically on Monday, we covered a lot of good stuff, more than I was expecting. So we're really in pretty good shape here. So I was going to originally say that this video wouldn't be too long, but in practice, I'm gonna include some other videos within it. So it'll be probably these lecture videos will be about an hour put together. That's what I'm guessing anyway. But in terms of the book readings, there's not all that much. I ended up splitting it up in the syllabus, so there's like 5 pages for here and 5 pages for there, so there's not too much. So we're not covering too much material today, but I want to provide some context and talk about Protestant art. And, you know, I say Protestant art, but I'm also going to talk a lot about Catholics too. We're actually going to take a step back and we're going to look at Catholics in the Renaissance in the northern part of Europe. Of course, during the Renaissance, you know, that's still early enough that everybody's Catholic, or so they like to say they are. But it's really interesting that the Renaissance influenced the northern part of Europe in different ways. And here I'm talking about especially like Germany and England. These were countries that were kind of coming to their own during the time of the Renaissance, figuring out who they were. And they definitely picked up a lot of Renaissance ideas, Renaissance culture. And in the time period we're looking at now, which is like more like the 1500s and 1600s, they evolved even further and sort of developed their own particular culture. So all that's pretty cool. So in practice, we're going to be looking at a few different Catholics today, and we're actually going to be going back in time a little bit to say, you know, okay, so we had the Renaissance in Italy, and we talked a lot about what that was like there. But one thing we haven't talked a lot about is how that culture kind of percolated up, traveled up to Germany and England and places like that, and influenced those cultures as well. And the way the Renaissance played out there was actually a little bit different from the way it played out in Italy. So I'm going to go into that. So I just want to make sure we're screen sharing. We're recording, I think. Yes, we are recording. And let's make sure we're sharing the sound because we're going to need that later. Okay. Can you tell I did this before? All right. So let's talk about those Renaissance Northerners, or how do you combine Catholicism and the Renaissance? Now, with the Renaissance, we talked a lot about humanism, this idea of like studying humanity specifically as a thing, human beings as being this important sort of concept, and one of the big questions of the Renaissance being how do you perfect society? Back in the Middle Ages, that wasn't a question people were asking so much, but they were getting more into the work of the Greek and Roman authors and thinking about how do you make human lives good on earth? Not just how do you make them go to heaven, but what if we value what's going on earth as well? And then you know, specifically, they focused a lot on the Greek and Roman authors. Well, how it turned out in the North was a little bit different. They ended up being kind of taking that humanism and fusing it with an interest of religion. So where the Italians were reading a lot of the Greek and Roman authors and saying, oh, let's really analyze these texts and let's use them to figure out how to make the perfect society. The Northerners did basically the same thing, but with the Bible and with the works of the great theologians from ancient times. So they still read plenty of Greek and Latin, only they focused on philosophers more in the context of religion, and they focused a lot on theologians and on translating the Bible. But they brought that same sort of analytical mindset. Let's really analyze these texts. Let's figure out what their deal is. You know, how do they suggest we should create a society if we look to the Bible specifically? So that's kind of the mood there. And what we basically have are what have been called Christian humanists. So humanists, they have an interest in humanity, but they put more emphasis on Christianity than the Italian folks did. Not that the Italian folks were ever like not emphasizing Christianity at all. They weren't ever atheists, and they always sort of looked to religion, but they kind of put them in 2 different boxes. You know, here's the religious stuff over here, and here's the humanistic stuff over here. Whereas the Christian humanists, it's all the same box. Humans are noble and interesting, and human society is important specifically because of God. So let's learn from God how to make this perfect society. So it's pretty interesting that they were able to sort of bring those things together and study the texts themselves and do more translations in the same way. So I want to mention a few of these different movements that we could sort of call Christian humanist. One of them was the Imitation of Christ movement, or Imitatio Christi. I mentioned this, I kind of alluded to it in our discussion on Monday, but actually, this was a particular book that spawned this whole movement called The Imitation of Christ by a fellow named Thomas Kemp. And one of the things that's different about this is that it was not about how to be a good monk. It was about how to be a better Christian as someone who's not a monk, as what's known as a lay person, an ordinary person who hasn't gone into the monastery or the priesthood. And that's pretty new. Like I said, Catholics up until this point and through the Middle Ages seem to have the idea that monks were doing the ones who were like the really hardcore connection to God, and everybody else, you just try not to sin too much, more or less. You listen to your priest, you try not to sin. You do the rituals like baptism and whatnot, but other than that, you don't have like a particularly hardcore relationship with God. But what if you could? That's basically what Thomas Kemp is proposing. Ordinary people should get close to God. This is what's known as lay piety, people who are not monks and not priests learning to become more religiously devoted. That's an idea that really doesn't appear until the 1400s. And so this is pretty early on in the Renaissance. First half of the Renaissance, I guess you could say, but it already seems to be influenced by some Renaissance ideals. Ordinary people are important. That's a Renaissance idea. And so there's a new religious movement emphasizing ordinary folks. And you got to think that in connection to the church, being seen to be weaker during this time period, people might decide to sort of take matters into their own hands. Well, if the priests can't help me with my connection to God, I can do it myself. That seems to be kind of the idea. Although it never goes so far as to like break with the church as the Protestants do. One of the interesting currents of this is German mysticism, as exemplified by a guy known as Meister Eckhart. Meister Eckhart had a very different sort of perspective. He was, even before Thomas Kemp, he was kind of contemporary with the Avignon papacy. But his ideas reflect that sort of moving away from focus on the organized church, even though, they're all still Catholic. They're sort of more distant Catholics. They're Catholics who are independent of whatever the church is saying. And Meister Eckhart said some things that are very different from what you normally hear Christians saying. For instance, he said, the ultimate riddance is getting rid of God to go to God. And what he meant by that is getting past your idea of God to get to the actual God. In fact, he would tend to describe God as something very beyond what human beings can perceive. Even the name God is misleading. Even the traditional images of God are misleading. God is sort of this miraculous existence beyond all that, this sort of undescribable thing that you can sort of intuitively grasp when you're praying, but you can't, put it into words. Now, this starts to sound an awful lot like Eastern philosophy, like the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao, or the way Hindus talk of Brahman. So it's very different. And this is sort of mystical traditions. And this is something that comes more out of monks than of the church hierarchy. When monks are having their own individual religious monastic experience and praying to God, they are connecting to God on this very intuitive, personal level. And Eckhart basically argued that this was available to everyone. And that's very different from what the church hierarchy was saying. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, he was accused of heresy and he was put on trial. But he ended up dying of old age, apparently, or at least it seems that way, before he could actually be burnt at the stake or anything like that. So he, is that a win for him? I guess so. But yeah, he was really influential. And there were others like him who were mystics. They sought an individual connection to God more than the priestly connection to God. And mystics throughout a lot of different cultures seem to have that in common, that they are focused on their own experience of meditation or prayer rather than what anybody else is telling them. And a movement spawned from this later on, which is called the Friends of God movement, which I just really like. It was another sort of lay piety movement influenced by Eckhart's ideas. And just Friends of God, that's such a different concept than God the Father or God the King, God the Friend. That's a different mood. And I have to admit, I kind of like that way of thinking about things. So yeah, so we had a few different sort of lay piety movements, and just this emphasis on, ordinary people can find their own religious path, even in the context of the Catholic Church. So if we think about all this, we're almost starting to see some precedent for Martin Luther, aren't we? Martin Luther cropping up in Germany a 100 years or 200 years later. There was a willing audience there, people who were looking for something new and looking for something that was more about ordinary people rather than the church. At least that sure seems that way. One more of these sort of laying the ground type of folks was Erasmus. Erasmus is fascinating. He was like the Renaissance man in being this scholar, this master of ancient languages, this guy who was fascinated by the achievements of Greece and Rome, but he was doing it in a Christian humanist sort of way. He really exemplified the study of, let's study the Greek Bible, let's analyze the New Testament and learn about it and find the best version of it. So he really was all about the Christian side of things. He was also really influential in terms of collecting Greek and Latin texts, and he saw the ancient philosophers as kind of the predecessors of Christianity. So he was intensely religious, but in this way that was all about like gathering information and sharing it with people. He wasn't the type to hoard information for himself. He was, trying to build a library that other people could use. So he tried to find the best versions of all the Greek and Latin texts, and figure out what they were, what was out there, what was hiding in all the monasteries. If you put it all together, what do you end up with? That was the sort of stuff that Erasmus got up to. And today, we have like these standard collections of Greek and Roman writings. We are pretty sure we've found all of the stuff that's out there, unless it's sort of buried in a tomb somewhere and we find it later. Erasmus was one of the folks who set up a library like that. So we owe a lot to him. And he could see the sort of philosophers and the less theological authors as part of a greater context. For him, Greek and Roman culture was valuable because it created Christianity, but all that stuff is sort of a context for it. It's not to be ignored. On top of that, he was an influence on how we pronounce the Greek language. Like I went to Greece and I talked to some people there, and some of them were very down on the Erasmian pronunciation of ancient Greek. So I had to look that up. And it turns out Erasmus basically came up with the standard pronunciation of ancient Greek. The one that is, for the most part, the more popular pronunciation. I would say the majority of scholars agree that Greek should be pronounced in this way. But in modern Greece, especially in connection with the Greek church, if someone's going into the seminary, into the priesthood, they prefer a pronunciation that is more close to the way modern Greek is pronounced. And that's fair. I mean, I personally prefer to pronounce Greek like English as often as I can. That's just how it is with languages. I also think there's something to be said for the fact that the texts that they're working with are from later on. And by that time, by the time of Christianity, the Greek language had changed a lot. So maybe it works better for the religious context that they're in, which makes it kind of funny that Erasmus was so religious. But the Erasmian pronunciation maybe works better for analyzing like the pronunciation of Plato and Aristotle and folks like them. But yeah, he's still a household name, at least among people who like ancient Greek. So there you go. And then on top of that, Erasmus was not just a scholar, he was also a writer. Of course, the line between the two was much thinner back in the day. He is known for particularly satire. The Praise of Folly is his notable work. And this is a very weird work. It's sort of ironic, and we don't really get like deeply ironic writing before this. I mean, we get some in Rome, but like it had been a while since like in like medieval Renaissance, we didn't really see a whole lot of like being super ironic and, saying the opposite of what you mean just to sort of tease and make people think. But Erasmus does that. He is talks about all these different aspects of society, and he says, oh, they're all good because they lead to more folly. and by which he means, stupidity, foolishness, madness. And he's saying, oh, folly, it's so great. And of course, he's being as sarcastic as hell. And what he's doing is saying, oh, isn't it great how like priests are being dumb and how merchants are being dumb and how, scholars are being dumb, all of this stuff. And so he acts like he's praising, but he's using it to really just make fun of all those things and to show the flaws in society. And, by implication, he's suggesting how things can be made better. So that's the praise of folly there for you. And it has this sort of meta level awareness of society, right? This higher level of thinking about society, not just as a thing that exists, but as a thing that can be approved upon. That's a very Renaissance type of thinking. So he is a Renaissance Christian of the North, and he wouldn't have been able to think the way that he did without, I think, the influence of Renaissance obsession with society and all those families who were trying to show that their city was the best. Okay, I'm going to leave off the first video here. Next time we will discuss, in the next video, not next time, but in the next video we will discuss some more authors, and then we'll finally start getting into the Protestants. All right.